I want to just open this meeting before saying anything else or introducing our panel with a salute to the heroic revolutionary leader, Yahya Sinwar, chair of the Political Bureau of the Hamas Islamic Resistance Movement and organizer of the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood, who died heroically in battle along with other Hamas combatants on October 17th of this year, a martyr in battle against Zionism and U.S. imperialism. And his life is really an example. Resistance does not die with the martyrdom of leaders. Resistance lives on. It's driven by hunger of millions for liberation and for justice. And imperialism doesn't end with this or that politician at the helm. Its crimes continue relentlessly. So this is a book signing, and just before I even say more, I do want to mention a book that's not on the agenda, but worthy of its own event soon. And that is that Yahya Sinwar wrote a fascinating book called The Thorn and the Carnation during his long years in prison. It's painful, every page is a history lesson, but it's so simply told, you think it's a child speaking. It seems to have no analysis when you read the first and many chapters. But the first, it's really consciousness, how it unfolds. What side are you on? And you know that in every page, a worldview, and that in a real sense.
Nobody can hear you
On Zoom. Well, okay, we're on pause then while we figure this out.
Could they watch Danny's live stream?
The live stream is good.
Okay, so mute it now.
Can we silence that phone?
Sarah, I think you could.
Do we think there's sound again?
We're good.
Yeah, it looks like it is.
Okay, well, these are the problems of technology, that not only do we have, big struggles have these struggles of technology, you can bet. So I was just saying that it's a book with, it doesn't seem like a heavy analysis, but with every page it asks, what side are you on? And it's someone who knows what side they're on, has a worldview. So in welcoming you to this meeting, this is really organizers of the Friends of Socialist China. I'm Sarah Flounders. I'm an active part of Socialist China, and as an organization that has existed really for several years. I'm also part of the International Action Center, the Sanctions Kill campaign, and a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper. This is a meeting in the space of the International Action Center and Workers' World Party, but also many organizing efforts meet here, from Amazon workers, laundry workers, student encampments for Palestine, the Venceremos Brigade for Cuba. Tonight is a meeting of Marxists who are never dry in theory, because this is a science always being reborn in struggle, endlessly forever green. Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, it's a history of all existing society as a history of the class struggle, and it's sure impossible to understand the world today without a Marxist lens. Marxism as a scientific outlook for action, to rally the oppressed, to take sides. And that means learning from and defending the political parties who are guiding revolutions that are transforming the lives of millions, coming to their defense. In the class struggle, it means constantly taking sides, consciously. There's no comfortable middle ground. There's a struggle against imperialism, and at its root, that is the class struggle today. To understand today's world, you need a Marxism that centers anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance. Now, we have an incredible panel tonight who really take a long view of history. They're writers who take sides in a global struggle, two sides, constantly in living struggle, the oppressed, the exploited, the working class globally. And it's that global view that's so essential. It is a global war for sure in a time of total epic change with an empire in crisis. As we meet, the BRICS Plus is meeting in Kazan. And you know, for the people of the world, this is more important, more decisive, actually of greater interest than the US elections. That the US corporate media imposes on the world, even those who have no say. Well, this vampire ball is coming to an end. Saudi Arabia just proposed joint military exercises with Iran at a time, when Iran has openly pledged to target US military bases in the region, including US military bases in Saudi Arabia, should the US dare to facilitate an Israeli attack on Iran. Now that's a surprise. It certainly shows that the world right now is full of real complex contradictions, and none of it is in the hands of the decision makers here. They're driven to war even when you would think it's absolutely going against their interests. So there's an architecture of a different type that's developing, and Israel today is a totally dependent proxy of the US. It's a colonial outpost in a dying empire, and it is committing crimes that you cannot turn on your phone one day without being horrified at what's happening right now, every minute, the level of ruin and destruction. And this is the plans they're messaging the world we want for anyone who dares to resist. So it's constant crisis under imperialism. Now, the point of theory is to change the world, and understanding the world, understanding the way it really is the best way to build real class consciousness. I was fascinated with the title of Gabriel, Western Marxism. Well, Western, Eastern, it's not a geographic term that is being discussed. It really is how we move forward and understand the world today, and how we really speak to each other in a world that is changing dramatically and radically. So I want to first introduce, and this is a big honor, that Carlos Martinez is here with us today. Now, I can't say Carlos Martinez and Keith Bennett have really helped to shape over years the Friends of Socialist China. And as such, what he's done in his research, in his writings, I think we first were very interested in his book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. That was published in 2019. And then his most recent book, which is really a tome of research, is The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. And this new book is an anthology of so many of the participants of the China at 75, People's China at 75. And I just want to highly recommend the work of what Carlos has done. And I think it really reflects so much the panel that's here today. So thank you. Let me pass this on. We're passing equipment down, and we're hoping this technology,
And can you ask people to mute their phones?
okay. Yes, everyone
Everyone
here,
put it on
mute
mute,
your phones.
please.
And if you can turn them off, that's great too, because it pops in with a little bit of interference. Thank you.
So Carlos, it's fine, like,
Yeah, just hold it.
yeah.
Great, and this is working? People can hear me? Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all the friends and comrades who are here in attendance, who are watching online, and of course to the organisers for very kindly and at short notice putting on an event for these two books, People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red, edited by myself and Keith Bennett, and Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism, edited by Gabriel. So just to say a little something about this book.
Louder.
Louder, okay, sorry. Better? Yes. Okay.
Too loud.
And now I've got competition. Yeah. So, yeah, just to say a little something about the motivation for putting this book together. Obviously, we had this milestone. The 1st of October this year marked the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And we thought it was appropriate and useful to just kind of reflect on that moment, you know, when Mao Zedong famously proclaimed in Tiananmen Square that the Chinese people have stood up. You know, it's a useful opportunity to reflect on the significance of that, which is not just a moment in history, but it's an evolving significance, because the Chinese Revolution impacted not just China, but it impacted the entire world, and it continues to impact the entire world. You know, the Chinese Revolution changed the world forever, and you know, these processes that it reflects of building socialism and struggling against imperialism are processes that continue, and modern China is very much a part of that. And you know, so we wanted to examine China's trajectory since 1949 and help people get to grips with China's socialist development in all of its phases. And you know, this is a topic that's really not very well understood, particularly in the West, and including among elements of the Western left. And I think, you know, maybe that's where the overlap lies with the two books that we're discussing this evening. You know, the Western Marxism that's described by Domenico Losurdo is essentially dogmatic. It considers socialism in the abstract. It considers it from a kind of purely theoretical viewpoint. And, you know, for these Western Marxists, if you ask them who's really pushing humanity's collective understanding of socialism forward, it's, you know, a bunch of Western male, typically white academics in conference rooms, you know, putting out vast, you know, enormous tomes of thousands of pages that are really at the cutting edge of knowledge production, right? But for Eastern Marxists, you know, to use Losurdo's terminology, and as Sarah mentioned, that's not really a geographic framing. It's a conceptual and ideological framing. It's the people that are actually, you know, these people are oriented to the actually existing struggle against imperialism and for socialism. And it's precisely those states, those movements, those parties that are engaged in the process of building socialism and struggling against hegemony that are making that real contribution to moving humanity's understanding forward. You know, this dialectical relationship between theory and practice is really the core essence of Marxism. You know, as Mao Zedong famously put it in his essay on practice, if you want knowledge, you must take part in the practice of changing reality. If you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself. You know, and abstract theory just doesn't help us very much when it comes to understanding modern China, right? Like, if you look in Marx's 3 volumes of Capital or 3 volumes of Theories of Surplus Value, you're not going to find a reference point for China's process of reform and opening up that kicks off in 1978, right? Apart from anything else, Marx and Engels didn't have the luxury of observing the development of state socialism, like with the exception of, you know, a few weeks of the Paris Commune. You know, they couldn't be expected to predict the sort of problems that might face a country like China in 2024 with its 1.4 billion people, 18% of the global population, with only 6% of the world's arable land. It has to feed that population. It has to respond to a situation where it's, you know, where the imperialist powers led by the United States are leading a campaign of encirclement and containment of China. It has to deal with nuclear blackmail and constant bullying. It has 14 land borders, and it has to break out of underdevelopment. It has to feed its people. It has to chart, you know, it's got a massive responsibility of charting a way forward for humanity. So you can't find any formulas for that. You know, you can read all the Marx you want and you can read all the Engels you want, but you're not going to find a magic wand that tells you how to defeat underdevelopment, how to prevent the overthrow of your revolutionary process by the imperialists, and how to build socialism and how to build a better life for your people, right? Like, just as no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, no revolutionary process proceeds, in a straight and predictable line. As Lenin put it when discussing the heroic 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland, whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. People see huge inequality in China. People see that there's billionaires in China. People see that there's private capital in China. People see there's McDonald's and KFC and Starbucks in China, and they say, well, this isn't socialism. We're here in the West, we're fighting for socialism, and the socialism that we envisage doesn't have billionaires and it doesn't have KFC. With apologies to people who happen to like KFC.
KFC in China is really good.
But
It's good.
But, if you want to talk about socialist things, what about the elimination of absolute poverty? What about the extraordinary improvements in people's living standards? What about ending homelessness? What about, the fact that you've got this vast Asian country of 1.4 billion people where literally every single human being has housing, everyone has access to decent food, everyone has clothing, everyone has access to running water, everyone has access to modern energy, electricity and gas piped into their homes, everyone has access to education, everyone has access to healthcare. Like, here we are in New York, the throbbing heart of modern capitalism, the home of the brave. How far would I have to walk from this office right now to find someone who doesn't have a roof over their heads and someone who doesn't have healthcare, right? I suspect not terribly far. So why is it that China has been able to solve these problems? Why is it that China is so focused on improving people's living standards and meeting people's most fundamental human rights? Why is it China that's so far out ahead when it comes to renewable energy and electric vehicles and biodiversity protection and afforestation? Why is it China that made so much effort to prevent loss of life during the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas in the US, over 1 million people died? Clearly, the answer has got something to do with China's social, economic, political project of socialism. The fact that China remains on the socialist path, that it's got a mixed economy in which the commanding heights are publicly owned, it's run by a Marxist-Leninist political party, and where the capitalist class is denied the right to organize in its own political interests. So in terms of the line that Lo Surdo draws in this book, in Western Marxism, I think it's reasonable to basically say, and forgive me if this is like an exaggeration or a simplification, but I think, on one side of that line, you have people who only criticize China and condemn China, people who label it as capitalist or imperialist, people who push the slogan, neither Washington nor Beijing. And on the other side of the line, you've got people who stand in solidarity with China, who seek to learn from China, who showcase China as an example of what can be achieved under socialism, and who resolutely oppose the US's plans to contain and encircle China, who oppose the US-led new Cold War on China. And so, yeah, this book, People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red, goes into some detail about the development of Chinese socialism over the decades. I think I've probably kind of spoken for long enough, so I won't go into like a blow-by-blow account of what's in the book, but it's got chapters on a number of topics: understanding socialism with Chinese characteristics, China's transition from socialism in the early phase from 1949 to 56, the significance of China's second centenary goal, which is, I should learn how to memorize this really, building China into a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious and beautiful by the centenary of the PRC in 2049, a pretty inspiring vision. We've got chapters on China's socialist democracy that kind of takes apart and dismantles this idea that China's just some authoritarian, dictatorial hellscape. We've got an article, a chapter on what common prosperity means. We've got an article on Mao Zedong's specific contributions to the theory of Marxism. We've got a chapter on building socialism and the ecological civilization, so around what China's doing on environmental issues. Patient Finance by Professor Radhika Desai, who's a good friend and will be well known to most people here. And the last chapter is by me on how China survived the end of history. So how China made it past that period, 1989 to 1991, where so many of the socialist countries, the Soviet Union and the people's democracies of Eastern and Central Europe collapsed. How come China didn't collapse? So it is, in my view, a very useful book, as is Western Marxism, edited by Gabriel. And yeah, with those words, again, thank you so much for organizing this event. Thank you so much for attending this event, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Let me just ask, because we're dealing with different technologies here, and I don't even know which things are on here or off.
It's on.
Okay, all right. You know, we got several mics going here, and I'm afraid to cough. This one, okay. So Gabriel Rockill is our next speaker. Gabriel Rockill is a philosopher of a different kind, not an academic, and an activist who has published 9 other books. He's a founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and a professor of philosophy at Villanova University, but very helpful in understanding and really critiquing the kind of housebroken, tamed Marxists of this predatory capitalist system. Those who strip Marxism of its revolutionary character, the academic Marxists who find ways to support their own imperialist government again and again against the rising anti-colonial and revolutionary struggles of the whole global South. And they will have every reason, because imperialism seeps into the very culture even of the working class here and of the movements here. That's where there's the most fertile ground. And it's constantly checking our ideas, but also learning consciously from Marxists of the anti-imperialist struggles who are centered concretely on, as Carlos was just saying, mobilizing the millions to change their own history. And they're facing horrific problems because they're the formerly colonized and looted countries of the world. So it's a very different process, a very concrete one, and one where we have enormous lessons to learn. So Gabriel Rockill, let me turn this on and pass this down. That goes close. This one can go further.
Thanks so much. Everyone can hear me okay? Yeah, we're good. It's a real pleasure to be here. It is an honor to share the platform here with Danny, Sarah, and Carlos. I think it's a great project as well to bring these 2 books together, because in many ways they're talking about a similar theme, but from 2 different perspectives. Domenico Losordo was an Italian Marxist who died a few years ago, but was a big supporter of China throughout his life, and I think wrote one of the most important accounts of why the reform and opening up in China is significant, because socialism is a collective, practical, concrete practice of learning, and the Chinese were studying what was being done elsewhere in the world, particularly in the Soviet Union, and they recognized that they had to take a unique path towards socialism, and Losordo identified that very early on. So I'd also recommend Class Struggle as a book of his that's available in English, spells this out in quite some detail. I'd also like to thank Workers' World for hosting us here, and all of the organizers and the other political parties and organizations that have been involved in making this happen. My comments today are also drawing on, I co-authored the introduction to this book with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, who unfortunately couldn't be here. So I am carrying forth the spirit of her thoughts about this project as well in my prepared comments. I'm gonna focus on Western Marxism, but I also just completed a book entitled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism for Monthly Review Press. As you can tell from the title, it goes into the political economy of knowledge production, circulation, and consumption, and examines the ways in which the Western Marxists did not simply arise organically as academics within the imperial core, but they were also directly funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class through their foundations, primarily Rockefeller and Ford, but there were others involved as well, as well as backed very heavily by the US national security state, including organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency and the US State Department. And so we see with their backers whose interests they ultimately serve, and bringing that political economy to the foreground is very important, because then even if you don't know anything about their theory or you haven't read any of their work, you know who supports them, and that should tell you everything you need to know when it comes to class struggle in theory. So the best way of understanding Western Marxism, in my opinion, is to clearly specify the driving force behind it, as well as its foundational ideological orientation. So Western Marxism arose and remains predominant within the imperial core. It is a type of Marxism that has been directly supported by the imperial ruling class, as I just mentioned, as a weapon of war against the anti-imperialist Marxism identified with the East, and actually existing socialism more broadly. So concerning Western Marxism, well, often Western Marxists will express some criticisms of capitalism, consumer society, neoliberalism, and these are people, if you're familiar with them, you know, it could be from the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, it could be more contemporary figures, David Harvey, Slavoj Žižek, Hart and Negri, Alain Badiou, the kind of titans of the imperial theory industry who self-proclaim as Marxists, but when you get into the details, they're theoretical Marxists rather than actual practical Marxists. And so they'll often be critical of capitalism, but they are overwhelmingly skeptical and generally hostile to actually existing socialism. So Western Marxism tends to reject Marxism in practice and has historically served, which has historically served as the principal means of breaking the chains of imperialism. Western Marxists are thus, at a minimum, capitalist and often imperialist accommodationists, meaning that they ultimately accept it because they refuse to support the real fight against it, which is actually existing socialist state-building projects. So bringing these threads together, we can say that Western Marxism, at the end of the day, would better be described as imperial Marxism, insofar as it emerges in and is dominant within the imperial core, which is the driving socioeconomic force behind this ideological product. And secondly, it tends to accommodate and even support imperialism. So both at the level of the socioeconomic base and at the superstructural level of the ideology, it is imperial. Eastern Marxism, by contrast, and this is one of the reasons that it's interesting to organize this kind of what would you call it, a counterposto? I don't know if someone's good here in music, but the montage between these two books is because Eastern Marxism has been widespread in the colonial and semi-colonial periphery, and it tends to reject imperialism while embracing the project of building socialism in the real world. We might then just simply call it anti-imperialist Marxism. This fundamental distinction ultimately allows us to bring into relief the two rival worldviews that can be found in imperial and anti-imperialist Marxism, which are essential for orienting ourselves in the world in general and in our organizing above and beyond theoretical class struggle between these two camps. Ultimately, Western or imperial Marxism is most important as a phenomenon, not in the academy, but insofar as it grips the masses in a broader world of organizing. In this regard, the two worldviews are on full display in the contemporary conjuncture insofar as much of the Western or imperial left has wildly mischaracterized contemporary imperialist wars, as well as the anti-imperialist movement. If it be among the intelligentsia or within the broader organizing world, there are many who muddle the waters, for instance, by claiming that countries like Russia, China, and Iran are imperialist or sub-imperialist. To make such a claim, you have to ignore centuries of material history and the concrete socioeconomic development of the planet, or underdevelopment over the overwhelming majority of the planet by the imperial forces. In this regard, the capitalist project of colonialism and neocolonialism has underdeveloped the tricontinent, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, in order to develop the imperial core, and more specifically, line the pockets of the imperial ruling class. Countries resisting imperial dominion have, either through bourgeois projects of national development or socialist projects of anti-colonial liberation, sought to remove themselves from the global chains of imperialist underdevelopment. In order to do so, they've had to develop their productive forces and work with other countries in a collaborative effort to push back against the imperial forces. On the flip side, you have the world's leading imperialist power, the United States, along with its junior partners, waging aggressive wars to try and break up the anti-imperialist camp and, in our conjuncture, the emergent multipolar world. This fundamental framing is absolutely essential for grasping the principal contradiction at work in our historical conjuncture. This framing recognizes that it is the socioeconomic base, namely imperial capitalism, that is the driving force in history, not the ideological superstructure. So to bring this into relief, the difference between imperial and anti-imperialist Marxism, I'd like to just briefly elucidate, and this will be the end of my comments, how these two traditions relate to two regions that occupy extremely important positions in contemporary global class struggle, China and Palestine. To facilitate the comparison, I'll focus on Losordo and the work of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which is widely recognized as being foundational to the tradition of Western Marxism. So people like Adorno and Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse, but this tradition continues today with the likes of Nancy Fraser, Sheila Ben Habib, and others. So Losordo, to begin with, always centered the colonial question and understood that socialism in the real world has taken the form of a fight on the part of the colonized peoples of the planet for self-determination. China and Palestine, with very different histories, have both been subjected to colonialism in various forms. In the case of China, it was able to break the chains of imperialism and begin a project of building socialism. One of the strengths of Losordo's analysis of China is that he mobilizes a dialectical understanding of socialism, meaning that he sees it as a process of socioeconomic transformation that emerges within an imperialist world. Moreover, socialism is what he calls, I mentioned this in my opening comments, a practical process of learning, since it is not the result of a blueprint or a perfect theory. It's not to be found, as Carlos was saying before, in a quotation from Marx or Engels. It is about a real-world project of building socialism in a hostile world. So having closely studied the case of the Soviet Union, China learned to chart its own unique path. And one of the things that Losordo points out in his support for the reform and opening up is the way in which China has always been pragmatically oriented to solving problems in the real world and recognized and continues to recognize that within an imperialist world, you have to deal with the extant play of forces. And if you simply enter into a compatible relationship with them, as the Soviet Union had done in a slightly different form, then you are not necessarily destined to collapse or run into problems, but it will easily lead to a whole series of complications that were visible from the Chinese perspective within the Soviet Union. Now, the Western left intelligentsia has generally tended to see the reform and opening up as China's fulsome embrace of capitalism and even imperialism. What Losordo provides us with, and this is another aspect of his dialectical approach to socialism, is looking at all of the different dimensions of the Chinese socialist state-building project, highlighting some of the things that Carlos just pointed out, where the towering heights of the economy are still in control of the state, where the state itself is in the hands of the Communist Party, where there is capitalist investment within the country. There are forms of development that are dependent on capitalist investment, but if you actually go through and analyze all of the different dimensions, you're given a much more complex understanding of contemporary China than the very simplistic, very binary apprehension that you get in the Western intelligentsia, where at best what you have is, well, it used to be Marxist and now it no longer is, right? So it's a very reified, or what Engels would call a metaphysical approach, where you simply think that a country is reducible to one concept. So it's either real socialism or it's absolute capitalism, and those are the only options. Instead of a dialectical apprehension that looks at the complexities of a historical situation in which there are very clearly, as Carlos pointed out, socialist elements operative within the project of contemporary China. By contrast, the Frankfurt School has tended, with very few exceptions, to ignore or downplay the colonial question while denigrating the efforts of the target countries of imperialism to develop socialism as a means of breaking the chains of imperialism. To cite but one example, Adorno and Horkheimer published one of their most overtly political texts in 1956, in which they celebrate, with only a few minor exceptions, the superiority of the West while denigrating and disparaging the Soviet Union and China by invoking stock racist descriptions of the purported barbarians in the East, who they described as, quote, fascists, who had chosen, quote, slavery. At the same time, Adorno and Horkheimer, as well as the purportedly radical Herbert Marcuse, who worked for years for the State Department and was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation for the Marxism-Leninism project, which is a direct attack on Eastern Marxism and actually existing socialism, Marcuse as well was a supporter, like Adorno and Horkheimer, of the imperialist settler colonial project in historic Palestine. This tradition of anti-communism and imperialist accommodation, or even imperialist support, has continued unabated today, with the most recent representatives of the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, Rainer Forst, and Sheila Ben Habib, criticizing those who attribute, quote, genocidal intentions to Israel. This is what Habermas and Forst have said, and this was soon after the beginning of the onslaught against the most recent onslaught against the Palestinians, at a time at which the genocidal intentions were clearly stated by Israeli leadership, and the genocidal actions were being live streamed to everyone around the world. Sheila Ben Habib has claimed that, quote, the conflict in Israel-Palestine, right, conflict in Israel-Palestine, her language, analyzing it through the lens of settler colonialism alone is reductive, as if understanding this history in terms of settler colonialism was somehow, leaving fundamental aspects out of the equation. Almost a year into Israel's war on Palestinians, and for that matter on Lebanon and the entire region, Ben Habib defended her earlier article, insisting that Hamas is not a resistance movement, and that it, Hamas, not Israel, is, quote, holding the people of Gaza hostage, end quote. These are the leading Marxist luminaries of the imperial core. And what this brings clearly into relief is that the real relationship between imperial Marxism and anti-imperialist Marxism can be seen as a relationship between the rear guard of history, the people who are holding us back, just like the imperial core is holding humanity and the entire planet back, versus the anti-imperialist Marxists who are the vanguard of history, who are Marxists who are not only inventing new theories, newfangled concepts, new ways of thinking, but they're doing the most difficult task in the process of thinking, because they're applying thought to practical problems, and they're finding ways of solving those practical problems in a hostile world. So it's in this regard that bringing these two books together, one slightly more theoretical, one oriented a bit more towards practice, but ultimately both of them contributing to a very strong criticism of imperial Marxism in the name of uplifting anti-imperialist Marxism, I think is a very important contribution for the debate today, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. So thank you.
So next, we're going to hear from Danny Haiphong, who has a tremendous program every day, really, of interviewing, putting it forth an anti-imperialist perspective in ways that are on the immediate issues of the day. And that could be NATO in the Ukraine, of course, often China and Danny's visits to China, but every part of the world, including the struggle right here. And we're in the center of imperialism, so the focus on it and the recognition that this is the enemy of the people of the whole world is a very important role. Danny is also a founding member of the Friends of Socialist China. So let me pass it on to Danny and to thank him also for his programs.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone who came today. Thank you to all the organizers. Thanks to Carlos and Gabriel for their great works and their great talks. I am going to focus on something a little different. I will be talking about China's foreign policy in particular, and how it contrasts with U.S. foreign policy, not just because that's what I do a lot in my work, but also because in respect to what Gabriel and Carlos were saying, but also Carlos's book talking about People's China at 75, making this argument that the flag does stay red, that Chinese socialism is indeed not only not on the decline, but also on the rise and getting stronger. We can look at China's foreign policy as a huge example of this. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk about where we are right now. We have an incredibly intense 3 major fronts of war right now in West Asia and Ukraine, and the buildup in the Asia Pacific against China, led mainly by the United States and its European partners. Of course, war is truly global, and this leaves out Latin America, it leaves out the militarization of Africa. But on these major fronts, it is very much apparent that the imperial order, the United States' imperial order, is at the root. This unipolar order that much of the multipolar world, led by China and its major partner, Russia, call it. So it's not China right now displacing 1 million people in Lebanon or killing thousands of Lebanese people. It's not China that over the last year has seen the genocide of Palestinians, where upwards of 200,000 people have died by bunker bomb or by starvation or disease. And it certainly isn't China that sacrificed over 200,000, some say 500,000 Ukrainians at the altar of NATO's proxy war against Russia. If we trace the roots of all of this death and all of this destruction, we always find US weapons, logistical support, coordination, and of course, outright participation. Now, the BRICS summit just ended in Kazan, and I think it's a towering example of this contrast I wanted to talk about between China and US foreign policy. At the BRICS summit in Kazan, China made a huge splash, maybe the biggest splash at the summit, when Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the first diplomatic meeting between the two countries in 5 years to finalize, along with other matters, a huge border deal, which essentially de-escalates along this 1,500-kilometer border, which is the source of much tension that has been provoked, in my estimation, by the West. So this has sent shockwaves down the spines of the warmongers in Washington and the corporate media. And in his address to the BRICS summit, Xi Jinping said that this mechanism, this multilateral mechanism, is indeed a major stepping stone of global solidarity for the global South. And we see this quite clearly in how China is behaving with a country that's supposed to be one of the most contentious, dare I say, enemies. There's really bad blood in many respects between India and China. We have just witnessed one of the biggest steps toward remedying those disputes in recent history. Belarus, the leader of Belarus, Viktor Lukashenko, said that without China, there would really be no BRICS. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why does China behave this way? Why is China pursuing multilateralism? Why is it pursuing multipolarity? Why is it pursuing friendship with everybody, any country, any nation that wants friendship, that wants peace, that wants cooperation, that wants development? Why does it do this? Because we hear all the time in the Western mainstream media, China's the aggressor. China's bullying its own province, Taiwan. China is expanding its reach at the expense of its neighbors, and China is debt-trapping African countries and countries in the global South. Of course, all of this is merely imperial doublespeak and projection that simply negates and masks China's true role as a diplomatic and economic force for peace in the world, which I believe at its core has to do with China's social system. And if you go to China, that is what many people will tell you, that it's their social system. It is their social system of socialism with Chinese characteristics that informs this. Just take the Belt and Road Initiative. I'll just throw out some examples. This is a 150-plus country integration project. You have 30 organizations internationally also signed on. You have over $1 trillion US. So if you times that by about 8, you get 8 trillion Chinese yuan invested in this project, where accomplishments just in the last decade, 15 years alone, have included the first metro system in Lahore, Pakistan, the monumental high-speed rail project that was opened up in Laos just a few years ago, which connects Laos to not just Kunming, China, but also its neighbors like Thailand. We could go on and on and on about all of the different projects, the electricity, the 5G technology that it's brought to African countries like Nigeria, and of course the forgiveness of loans, which we don't really hear about. We hear about these mysterious airports like in Uganda, this mysterious port in Sri Lanka that supposedly went awry, but you never hear about the 19, 20 African countries that China forgave loans for during COVID-19 when the world economy was essentially plunged into disaster, not by China. China kept growing during COVID-19. China was one of the few countries that did during that economic crisis, but it was plunged into just absolute hell because of the Western world, because of the United States-led Western world. So let's also take the example of diplomacy, because a lot of attention is placed on how China behaves economically around the world, how negative it is, when indeed a lot of its contributions are positive. But just diplomatically, in the last couple of years alone, we've had all of the Palestinian resistance groups go to Beijing and sign the Beijing Declaration, which essentially is a roadmap toward not only resolving differences between these groups, but establishing a legitimate Palestinian state that takes into account all of the different forces that are vying for leadership and attempting to cooperate through the Israeli genocidal onslaught sponsored by the United States. Then you also had the normalization deal that was brokered in Beijing in 2023 between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is already paying dividends. We see that in this creep toward an all-out war with Iran, where Saudi Arabia is even more vocal than before in rejecting the United States using its airspace, rejecting Israel using its airspace in order to conduct any kind of retaliation and strike against Iran. Funny word, retaliation, when actually it's Iran being attacked by the United States and by Israel. And of course, we can talk on and on and on about how China has been a force for integration in Asia as the foremost leader of the ASEAN group and this magnificent free trade deal that these countries have sponsored that is always tarnished and ignored by all of this Taiwan question. Will there be an invasion of Taiwan? Will there be a war over Taiwan? When is there going to be a war with the Philippines? There's always some reason for the United States and the West to talk about China in this way, but the reality is that China is trading, it is cooperating with all countries. Doesn't matter their political system, it is taking a very diplomatic approach and a very economic approach that benefits everybody in that region and the rest of the world. And we have to ask ourselves, then why is there so much apprehension toward China? Well, in my estimation, it's not just because it plays this huge role with the multipolar world, with this world that includes many social systems working together in order to bring development and peace. It is also because China still subscribes and will, in my opinion, continue to subscribe to socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is for this reason that China will never have respite from the United States or its Western partners. And that is why every single imperial project, every war, we can look at and say all roads are leading to Beijing. Some may disagree with you. Some think Russia is the primary enemy of the United States right now. But if you look at how the U.S. empire talks about these two countries, it is always in conjunction with each other. And you can see the calculations being made about, well, what is the order of toppling these countries? It always goes usually Iran, Russia. You can kind of now at this point in history, because Israel is on this genocidal and absolutely suicidal onslaught, now they can be almost seen together. But generally, the order is, let's go from smaller to bigger. Let's topple the Libyas, let's topple the Syrias, let's get to Iran, let's go to Moscow, and then let's end it in Beijing. That's why they call that's why the United States and its elites and those who are building up these wars, they call it containment. Because at this moment, they do not believe that they can win any kind of military conflict. They already gambled and lost one in Ukraine, and they know in their heart of hearts that such a thing would be even worse with China. Now, I think what's so striking about China in particular is how much animus there is toward China, not just from people who you would expect. You'd expect people who are rabidly anti-communist, who have been injected with yellow peril, fear, and hatred for decades, if not centuries, who grew up in the Cold War and who believe that all forms of socialism and communism must be eradicated. You expect those people to hate China, to want to see China overthrown. But at this moment, and that's why I think books like People's China at 75, as well as Western Marxism, are so important, because at this moment, actually, one of the biggest problems we have is that much of the so-called left actually hates China, and that their hatred of China, their animus toward China, is one of the most counterproductive developments and realities that we face as a people, as a movement, and as a project for peace. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why is this? Well, People's China at 75, Western Marxism, these books will tell you why this is. They'll tell you about how there are deep forces in the academic and even in the activist communities that work to undermine our ability to have solidarity, to connect and lock all of these conflicts, these wars, toward a single common cause. But it's actually quite easy. The U.S. empire, these imperialists, these rulers, the ruling class, they tell you what the reasons are. They'll tell you in the Western mainstream media what they are. They won't be framed in the words that we would want them to be framed in, because they frame them in terms of propaganda war. They talk about how much they fear China's economic rise. They talk about how, but at what cost is China's poverty alleviation or its infrastructure development or the rising standard of living in China? They'll talk about all this. They'll talk about human rights. They'll project all of this human rights animus and propaganda and misinformation. They'll do all of this. And at the same time, what they'll say at the end is, well, China is a competitor. China is a rival. They won't tell you why, though. The biggest reason why is that China is charting a mode and system of development right now in the world, which actually is a threat. It's not the threat that we hear, China threat, oh no, China's stealing our technology, which just means China's doing it better than us. It's not, oh, China is genociding the Uyghurs or something ridiculous like that. It's a threat because China is raising the standard of living of its own people. China is also raising the standard of living, the World Bank will tell you, of people all around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, its development projects. All of this has brought hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs all across the world, rising the standard of living for nations which have had no alternative since the fall of the Soviet Union. That's the reality. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States essentially, what it did was it said, we will give you one option, and that's the military option. We will allow you to exist so long as you allow us to be the foremost military power. Your economies be damned. We do not care. Take those IMF loans. You can be left to die. This is why U.S. investment in Africa is barely over 40 billion US dollars. There's 50 plus countries in Africa. It's one of the most richest continents in the world, if not the richest. And yet, only 45 billion US dollars invested in any kind of economic development in Africa. I think that tells the story. China, over 200. It's creeping toward 300 billion because China sees the worth of helping people who have been super exploited for decades, centuries. They see the worth in rising their standard of living. And you go to China and they'll tell you, it's not necessarily all about what they would say, like solidarity or charity. It's not charity. It's not, oh, well, we want to give back, right? It's none of that. Actually, what it is China is rapidly growing. China and Chinese people see a lot of their, as Gabriel said, with regard to Palestine, with Africa, a lot of Chinese see Africans as having a shared history. This dates all the way back to the beginnings of the Chinese Revolution with projects like the Tanzam Railway. But now they see also there is so much potential for African people to become, because they're so wealthy, they're sitting on this bed of wealth, of natural resources. If they build up their industries, they raise their wages, they can become consumers of Chinese goods. And that will help China relieve pressure on their own massive manufacturing economy and also allow African people to live better, to have 5G technology, to have trains, to have electric vehicles, to have these things that have been denied to them for so long, despite literally sitting on all of the natural resources that are required to produce them. But we cannot even have this discussion because much of the so-called left wants to talk about how China is authoritarian, or China is a dictatorship, or China's socialist and that's bad. All of this nonsense, what Carlos called the neither Washington nor Beijingers, those who believe that China is a competitor of the United States and no different from the US, that it'll just adopt. There's even an argument, you might know him, John Mearsheimer, a realist. He'll say, well, once China's in the position of the United States, then it will be like the United States. Once it has the ability to traverse its own waters in the Pacific without any threat to its own position, then it will be like the US and begin to terrorize countries around the world and look after only its own interests. That's what I guess realists believe. But I think in the real world, if we go into the real world, we can ask ourselves, well, why would anyone think this? What material basis, what reality are they looking at? And I think the answer to this is they're not. They're looking at this land of ideals that we live in the United States, this fantasy of American exceptionalism, that there can really be no alternative to how the United States and its imperial order does things. That if that isn't what is, then nothing else really can be. If I'm to, I feel like I sound like Kamala Harris there. But I think I made a little more sense than her. So we can just look at China's foreign policy. We can look at what China is doing. China is calling for diplomacy in Ukraine, a real resolution, peace. That's what it's calling for. China is looking to become not just a diplomatic force for peace in West Asia, but also it's offering, and it will. It has done this, it has committed to this in Syria and Iraq, to rebuild those countries, to rebuild Palestine once there is the conditions present for that to happen. But of course, we can see that China is not the bully. China is not waging war. China is not spending enormous sums of money to commit war crimes for the sake of profit and dominance that is required to keep this system, this bloody system, this greedy system of empire, of imperialism, of capitalism going. So we have a choice. I think we have a choice right now. And that's why I don't do geopolitical analysis and say, oh, well, let's just look at the facts. I think we have a choice. We need to be part of this process. We need to talk about China. That's why books like this are so important, like People's China at 75. We need to talk about this process at its root. We need to build real understanding. Every time I go to China, that is what I am trying to do, build real understanding of what people there are doing, what that government, what that system is doing. Not what the Western media says it's doing, not constantly having to show people, and I don't even like doing this, but last time I was in Xinjiang, it's like, hey, look, Uyghurs exist, they do things, they play basketball, you know, they're professors, they're normal people, and guess what? Those normal people also talk about their country and their existence far different than what we hear in Bloomberg or The Economist or what have you. So we need to get out of that position, but the only way we can is by looking at these problems at the root, looking at empire at the root, and not simply just following developments, waiting for the United States, waiting for this empire to make what really will be the last war that it fights. Because, in the words of Victor Gao, who I spoke to earlier today, former interpreter of Deng Xiaoping, he said, it'll be Armageddon, and that will be it, that it will be over. There will be nothing left for anybody. But this is why China says no war. They don't want war. They're not trying to fight a war with the United States. If they wanted a war with the United States, they could easily, they could easily just resolve the Taiwan question militarily and say, this is it. No more money to Taiwan separatists, weapons to Taiwan separatists, no more of this provocation. We will not only encircle and blockade this island, but we will reunify by force. And yet they don't do it. And why doesn't China do it? Because they want a peaceful resolution. They want peaceful reunification. And they want, that is the model for all of China's foreign policy. And that exists because China's system is at the root in the forefront of its foreign policy. And that's why it's able to succeed at the home front. That's why it's able to raise standard of living, to eliminate extreme poverty, to become the leader in high tech, to become the leader in renewable energy, and to do things that we didn't know humans could do before this, to be able to go from one of the poorest countries in the world to now the most prosperous, as well as soon to be one of the most shining examples of what it means to distribute that wealth and distribute that prosperity in a way that serves everybody and not just a few. So I'll stop there. I know we have some program to go, but thanks to everyone who came, thanks to the authors, and of course, thanks to the viewers. But yeah, all right.
Okay, now we're going to open the floor for discussion. The way we thought we would do this is to take 2 or 3 questions or comments from folks and then allow the panel to answer or chew on sort of whichever question they want. Just some guidelines for the discussion. And you've probably heard this before if you've been here, but at this meeting, we practice progressive stack, prioritizing comments from people of color, women, queer, transgender, non-conforming people, people with disabilities, young people, and those who've not yet spoken. So there are many different considerations, but it isn't necessarily first hand up. We encourage participation from the full body, and we really want to avoid back and forth between 2 or 3 people. Be mindful of the length of your remarks and comments, and wait until you're called on, and try to keep it to within a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes. So we'll take 3 or 4 questions first, and then give the panelists a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, to answer the point that most intrigues them or where they think they can contribute. And then we'll take another round. But we really do say at all our meetings, no personal attacks, no insensitive language, don't interrupt each other, respect the facilitator and this agenda, and ask clarifying questions, but don't make inferences or assume intent. So those are the ground rules for all of our discussion, and we'll try to, with a little help here.
Can I see that? I just want to.
Yeah.
I think, what would be easier? Would it be easier for me to run around and get the mic and camera in front of people, or should I just repeat what they said? I can't repeat comments. I hope you guys don't have too many comments. It should be questions. I know these meetings usually end up with a lot of comments, but
No, if you can summarize, that might be good.
it might be good, but I cannot summarize comments. Yeah, they could come to the front. I could give them the mic.
Yeah.
You know, that's easy.
All right, why don't we do that? We'll try to all be respectful, fit in, and get you on all these several cameras, different sound systems, different mics. No, but it's true, then you're sort of not on this or on that over there, or on this other sound system here, so. Let's see how it goes. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, so
As is
basically,
socialism, but as is the sound in this meeting.
so come on down, basically, right? Like
Right.
if there's maybe we can form a line
Okay.
here, or
Now, well, let's call on folks. So let's take a few questions or comments. Right here, okay.
well, I would need to
Well,
get
no,
the
it's
mic.
easier if you can come up here,
'Cause
is that okay?
If you don't want to be on this, that's fine. You can be outside. We just use the mic. Yeah.
Regarding the consequences of Western Marxism, I know that we may be able to take certain positions regarding a more anti-imperialist position supporting actually existing socialism. But are there any, for example, philosophical or political positions in the activist space that we take for granted that may come from downstream from let's say Western Marxism?
We're taking a couple.
Yeah, we're going to take 3 or 4 questions.
Thank you. What should our attitude be toward the imperialists, Marxists, the people on the left who deny, that socialism is actually happening in China, that call it capitalist? How should we relate to them to be useful, or is it, anyway, simple as that.
Yeah, so, oh, down here, camera for you.
Assalamu alaikum, peace for all. My name is Shahid Comrade, and I'm a Secretary General Pakistan USA Freedom Forum. And I'm really honored and thankful for the Workers' World International Access Center. They give us a chance to listen to distinguished people who has their mind, their opinion, and they have a courage to write in the world. So one thing is very clear. The conference hosted by Russia, it's a very good sign. It's supposed to be before, and why it's late? Because those people who has a brain in this world, they never raise the voice, or maybe they feel bad to use some other opinion, the idea what they like. That's not a good for any humanity. When you're dealing with the wolves against the humans, Israel against the Palestinian humans, against the peace, you should be very open and think about the humanity, not to defend any state which based on your ideology. So basic thing is the humanity. These sanctions, these dollar power, it was years before. They never got a chance to sit down like this. That's my opinion. And as a Pakistani, which is under assault last 77 years by the CIA, we have the recent victim of the regime change of Imran Khan, who is still in a jail. His wife just left the jail after January of this year, after 9 months, I think. And there's many, many women in the jail, political workers in the jail. So please pay attention, not to live in the jail of your ideas, ideology. Think about as a human, what's good for the human. And I think that will be very good relief for any real change and good for the humanity. If you young people take the lead and never afraid to criticize what you love. If anybody criticize, if any gives you the different opinion about your love, listen to them. Maybe it's good for you. So that's the Pakistan USA Freedom Forum feel this thing. And thank you very much for China, long friend of Pakistan. And the Silk Road is a basic thing over there. Yes, it's the interest of China. China is the first country who gave the 450 billion to the Iranian, I think. If I'm wrong, maybe please correct me. In years, coming years, 450 billion help. It should be, and will not be follow anybody, any power says that, okay, that's the terrorist, that's not a terrorist. So internationally you are bound, you cannot say Hamas, you cannot be a member of the Hamas, you cannot travel to the Europe. This is all old foxes against the humanity. British, France, Italy, America, new colonialists. So we have to fight against the colonialist monopolist. This is not good for the economy, but for fun. And let me raise the voice against this Quad. Before 1940s, we see the atom bomb from the air. But now, from the Australia to the Africa, there will be a atomic submarine in the all waters. It's 1,000 miles water, straits of the Australia, Indian Ocean, Arabian Ocean. So I hope our brainy people will pay attention to this thing and not think that that's a Muslim country, so we don't need anything. No, you have to learn other ideology. Thank you very much for your training for foreign policies.
Thank you.
Okay, shall we, let's hand it back to the panel to answer, and they can decide the order, and we'll just pass the mic along, so.
I mean, I can answer one, but if you want to go. Well, I want to answer the question about how do we relate to the left or communists, Marxists who are very critical of China. It's hard because they don't usually want to relate to us. That's that can be a problem. There's a sorry, something wrong? Oh, so that's a big problem. The big problem is that, and I've seen it, and I'll say it outright. I mean, we've got to call it out when we see it. You know, one of the hard things. It's been hard ever since Sheikh Jarrah. I saw it here in New York. I've been in New York for about 6 years, 7 years. One of the hard things is seeing elements of the Palestine movement waving flags, for example, of the East Turkestan so-called Uyghur separatist movement, and generally what happens in these debates and these discussions is that we don't actually talk to each other. What happens is there is such a strong impetus to reject any counter to these ideas or this reality, because many people think this is a deep reality. They believe that there is major crimes, there are major crimes happening in Xinjiang against Uyghurs. Now, it's hard to find evidence of that, but there's a lot of people who believe this, even in our movement. And so I think generally it's going to be very important to have forums, to have places where we can actually all come together and work this out. But I think that it's even deeper than China. I think China is such a key focal point right now in this moment of history, where if there is a war that's going to break out between the US and China, and the US will be the one to provoke that war, will be the one to wage that war, we are talking about the end of all human beings. And so I think with those stakes, with this nearly now a century of anti-communism, but when we look at China, just since the so-called McCarthyist era, we just look at all of those years, everything that Gabriel said about the infiltration of the academy, and then how that actually is a reality in so many sectors of our society, especially in the information war and in the information that we ingest. What we are dealing with actually is an inability to cooperate and have these kind of discussions. And China is just one issue where this is the case. This happens on so many different, especially on key issues of empire. It's happening right now with Russia. It's happened with Syria. It happened with Libya. It happened with Iraq. It continues to occur. There's always going to be these elements that say these governments are, neither Washington nor Beijing. We should not support Muammar Gaddafi. We shouldn't support Bashar al-Assad. We shouldn't support Xi Jinping. They'll say this. But at the same time, what they always negate is we don't even need to position our solidarity or our efforts for peace on that basis. But what we need to do is we need to have a dialectical framework, which in its core is about being actually curious about the contradictions of any phenomenon. If we don't even start from that place, then we are destined to be divided and completely separated. But I think the impetus for this falls on those forces, because I haven't actually I know Carlos pretty well. I know Sarah pretty well. I know people who do this work pretty well. Never really seen people on our side be like, well, we don't want to talk to those people because they think this way. No, actually, we're the ones who are always constantly communicating with them, challenging them, hoping that they'll talk back and that they'll communicate back, and that we can actually make this a public forum. We can have a battle of ideas, and we can see who wins. But generally, that's not the kind of fight that people who are so committed to spreading anti-China propaganda want. They generally want to be so doubled down on it that we have to wonder, well, and I think Gabriel had a lot of great points about academia, we have to wonder if they have a vested interest in this. We don't have the same kind of proof as we do with academia, but we know that there are forces that say that they are for peace and against empire that actually are not. So I think making clear those contradictions as well as finding any way to open up these forums is a good idea at this point. But I'll let anyone else who wants to talk.
Okay. Let me pass this on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I'll briefly come in on a couple of questions, if that's okay. Just starting with this same question on attitude towards those on the left that characterize China as capitalist. I mean, it's not something that I'd spend huge amounts of time on. I'm sure you've got other priorities, but one, you know, if you can pick up one thing from the Chinese approach to political science, I think there's a Chinese idiom which predates the revolutionary period, which predates the Communist Party of China, which predates Mao Zedong and predates Deng Xiaoping, but which they've really taken up, and that's seek truth from facts. And what are the facts about China? The undisputed facts that it's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, according to the World Bank's estimation, 800 million people. It's far and away the world leader in renewable energy, electric vehicles, biodiversity protection, and forestation. It's far and away the world leader in meeting people's fundamental human rights to food, to a roof over their heads, to work, to education, and so on. It's gone from being, you know, an extremely technically backward country to being a global superpower in science and technology. Since the founding of the People's Republic of China, life expectancy has gone from around 35 to around 78. Literacy has gone from around 10% to functionally 100%, right? Your people have their food needs met, they have their housing needs met, they have their energy needs met, their water needs met, and so on. And meanwhile, this is all done in the context of peace. You know, we've had development in the United States, we've had development in Europe, but the context was war and colonialism and pillage and conquest and slavery, right? China's had its rise in a context of peace. China hasn't even been at war in over 40 years. It hasn't dropped a bomb on another country in over 4 decades. China doesn't have a network of 800 military bases in the same way that the United States does. It has one military base, which is essentially a service center to protect shipping lanes off the Horn of Africa. China has nuclear weapons, but it's got about 1/10 the number of nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads as the United States, and it's the only nuclear power to consistently have a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. So it will never use nuclear weapons first. It will only ever use them in retaliation, in self-defense, and it's the only nuclear country to make the promise and the pledge that it will never use nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country. So this is what China has achieved. You're seeking truth from facts. These are the facts. And if it's capitalism that's achieved all that, well, let's be capitalists. You know, you should reassess. Don't reassess what you think about China. Reassess what you think about Marxism, about socialism. You know, maybe you need to switch to the other side. So that would be my recommendation. And just very quickly on this thing of positions in the activist space that come from Western Marxism, I guess like my one caveat, I'm halfway through the book now, and it's a brilliant book, Western Marxism. And you know, huge thanks to Gabriel and to Jennifer and to Monthly Review for bringing it to light in the English language. I get like the one thought I had is like that we've got an expression in British English. I don't know if you have it in American English as well. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe there's some useful ideas in Western Marxism. You know, you're talking about intellectuals and relatively serious thinkers in the West who are dealing with the types of problems that we deal with in advanced capitalist societies, which are not the countries where socialism is being built or has been built. You know, China's main focus is feeding 1.4 billion people, making sure people have a roof over their heads, making sure they have food on the table, making sure that they have jobs, and making sure that they can enjoy peace and they can enjoy stability and they can enjoy, you know, the unification of their country. So, you know, these are kind of survival questions, that's been the real focus. You know, things will change in China in the coming generations, and they are, you know, there is already a process of change in terms of social liberalism and all the rest of it. But China's not the most advanced country in the world when it comes to the transgender question, for example. It's making really impressive progress, and that's clearly the trajectory and the direction of travel when you know, we're experiencing the opposite direction of travel in the West. But you know, there's questions that are addressed by critical theory in the West where, you know, they're just dealing with questions that aren't at the forefront in countries like China. And, you know, I'm sure there are valuable things there. So we don't necessarily have to throw out everything, but we do have to recognize that at their core, as Gabriel has explained in meticulous detail, these are pro-imperial ideologies. Thank you.
I will as well just run through some of the questions. They're great questions. The first thing that I'd say picks up on what Carlos just mentioned, and that is that there's a difference between an ultra-leftist critique of Western Marxism, which would consist in saying, well, let's just, you know, get all the books by Deleuze and Lyotard and all these fancy French people and make a pile out of them and burn them and use the warmth, you know, to heat up our hands, versus a dialectical critique of Western Marxism. And a dialectical critique recognizes that, well, these are products of the imperial superstructure, and they have an ideological orientation that goes hand in hand with that. But they also are products that have benefited from the most developed, materially advanced systems of knowledge production in the history of the world due to the history of capitalist underdevelopment of the rest of the world. So it would be shocking if there wasn't something of value within Western Marxism because of the conditions of intellectual production that these people have had access to. I think one distinction that is helpful is also that between use value and exchange value. So much Western Marxism, Slavoj Žižek comes to mind because unfortunately he's the kind of court jester who's the face of Western Marxism, is all about exchange value. Right? He wants the buzz, he wants the hype, he wants some likes, and he'll say anything, including that we should give nuclear weapons to Ukraine, that we should, you know, support NATO in the most fawning way possible. And this is just in order to promote his own platform and to sell more books. That's very different than use value. Use value is when you're contributing to collective knowledge in order to advance a common project. And that is precisely what we get from the more Eastern Marxist tradition. Regarding the question of how to convince Western Marxists on the question of China, you've touched on this. I just want to shift registers a little bit, and that is that there's a lot of individual arguments that we can make. Danny highlighted some of them, Carlos highlighted some of them. I agree, you know, fully. But another element of that is that we need to develop systematic power. Because when you think of why it is that so many people, including on the Western left, are indoctrinated regarding China, it's not because an individual made a really good argument to them. It's because the capitalist ruling class owns the means of communication, and they constantly indoctrinate the entire population with the most developed propaganda apparatus in the entire history of the world. So for us to build power, we can't just do it. We need to do individual conversations, but we need, much more importantly, strong organizations, political parties that support what's going on in China. We need media platforms like the one that Danny runs in order to get the message out there. We need educational platforms. We need collective enterprises. We need publishing houses. We need journals. We need all of the collective infrastructure necessary to own the narrative as much as possible and take the fight on the offensive. So we're not simply always on the defensive. The last thing that I'd like to say is that the final comment concerning humanist Marxism goes to the heart of one aspect of Lesorto's project that I didn't touch on, but is quintessentially important for anti-imperialist Marxism. The term humanist Marxism, unfortunately, has been largely taken over by those who are critical of actually existing socialism for somehow being anti-humanist, because it's totalitarian, because there are all of these myths about gulags and genocides and all of this. But really humanist Marxism, as Lesorto has demonstrated in great detail, is the living tradition of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist Marxism, because this is a struggle not only to overcome exploitation, but to fight oppression in every way, shape, and form. The goal of anti-colonial Marxism is to lift up the dignity of all peoples, right? All nationalities, all races, all genders, all sexualities, and down the list. So humanist Marxism should be our term. We should not cede any ground on that front. And the goal of humanist Marxism is, in particular, to lift those up who are members of the most exploited and oppressed groups of humanity, those in the global south, third world, who have been historically underdeveloped by the history of imperialism. So we should own humanist Marxism and build up the collective power of class struggle necessary to go on the offensive.
What time are we?
8:42.
All right, so I think we have time for another round of questions, and I see several hands that are up who will be called on. I just want to also say that the ruling class here, U.S. imperialism, is acutely, the U.S. ruling class is acutely aware of the power of ideas. And when they allocate $1.4 billion for hostile propaganda against China, that was a recent allocation, just for China, just for China. It means that any journalist, reporter, academic, anyone with a company that wants a little extra funding knows exactly how to do it. Now, the ideas of a society are the ideas of the ruling class, and they impose it, they force it down, and nowhere is this stronger than on Palestine today. It doesn't stop change. It breaks through, and that is what has to be our confidence. But at the same time, we have to know every agency today of the U.S. government is actively involved in turning off any measure of solidarity with Palestine. That's the Department of Education, and to the Commerce Department with the recent attacks on Sami Dun, to every single conceivable agency is being utilized to turn it off. It doesn't change, though. And our role, this is where it really is combat, where the demonstrations are also part of the communication, where the actions of the encampments, where it is a battle of ideas, but it is also constantly ideas that are challenged in the street. So I'm going to call on Heather and then John are the two hands that I see up next. Is there another? Oh, and back there. Okay, yep, third hand. Okay. And we'll all get it in.
This is actually a very small sort of a question, but this is a very small question, but it's a very big question, because we've been discussing Marxism and the power of Marxists and the thinking of Marxists specifically about China, but really about the world, about imperialism and about war. But I didn't hear anything about Leninism, and I'm an old leftist, and my parents were old leftists. And I was taught to be a Marxist-Leninist, and I studied Leninism and Marxism in my life. And Leninism took Marxism on the road to revolution, and successfully. And the fact of the matter is that what we see, for example, happening in the Sahel, those people who are rising up in the Sahel in Africa, they're led by military men and women. And they are, in fact, Leninists and Marxists as well, and are looking to, and they are, in fact, taking the means of production, the gold, back to themselves, the other values that, in fact, that's what China did. China took itself back. The revolution was a violent revolution against imperialism. So I would like to hear how you think the concept of Leninism, which is Marxist, can be understood, because I actually think that that's one way of getting to those people, and I don't call them Western Marxists, I call them liberals. They really are liberals. If you don't like Marxism, you're not a socialist, so, you know, F you. But the fact is that if you can't answer that, I mean, there's a group in New York who will not take up the issue of Russia because it's not Marxist anymore. So they will not say that to be on the side of Russia against the it's not just Ukraine, it's against the United States. They don't do that. We don't have an anti-war movement in the United States. Leninists would have one. So I'm thinking that what we need as revolutionaries ourselves is to be able to encompass this and not be embarrassed by the fact that we believe that revolution is necessary to make socialist society here too. And that's the polemic that we can hand out to these folks, that we can absorb it, we can reread it, Lenin together or whatever, so that we can understand more how this is the way to argue. Because you can't just say, well, you know, come on, you really have to support China because they do this, this, and this, because they'll say but, and they'll give their baloney. Okay, that's it.
Hi, I'm John Catalanato. I'm one of the editors of Workers' World newspaper. I wanted to thank the panelists. I think they did an excellent job of explaining the impact that China and socialist China has on the world today. And it's something for a lot of revolutionaries or people who want to be revolutionaries to look up to. It doesn't solve all our problems, but it gives us a way of unifying. And I want to ask something, but I want to say a couple of other things too that I think were raised. And Gabriel kind of answered some of what I'm asking already. The first thing, the question is, do you anticipate that Chinese foreign policy will do more of the kind of thing it did when it got the all the different Palestinian factions together? Because they haven't been doing stuff like that for a long time. They used to do more of that in the old Mao Zedong days. Now, the other thing is, it's partly been answered by the other people. I don't think of this as like there's these lefts out there who are just that they're, well, we can call them Western Marxists, but that they exist in some kind of independent way. These ideas are ideas from the ruling class. They're imposed on people who are asking questions, coming up with reasons to criticize capitalist society. But when they say something that really challenges it, either by organizing mass action here or by showing solidarity with an existing socialist country, then they get punished. If they do something that criticizes them and do it in an effective way, they get a reward. And after a while, that changes what happens. So we have to have something which I think Gabriel referred to. We have to create something on the other side. I mean, I've been in Workers' World Party for more than 60 years. And I've always believed, since the beginning, since the people first taught me, that in order to take on a society that's run by a powerful ruling class that has control of the ideology and has control of the state apparatus, you have to build an organization that can fight it. You know, that's where Lenin would come in. Lenin has come in sort of implicitly in our solidarity with anti-imperialism, because Leninism, that was one big thing that the Russian Revolution did. It gave this whole impetus to the liberation movement of much of the world. But there's also the question of how to build, how to unify those of us who have the same thought, even that we were able take the initiative of the Friends of Socialist China and organize over here a unified meeting that was one step in building a unified struggle. And so I just wanted to, that's not really a question. My question is what you think China will do on it. I think you answer all the other questions very good, but how do we take your excellent answers and give them weight?
I'll try and be quick. I think my question is mostly for Danny. You spoke pretty glowingly about African development, I'm sorry, Chinese development in Africa, and I don't doubt any of your numbers, but as a consumer of Western media, because that's all there is, you read about certain Eastern Hemisphere entities like Russia with all types of military and seemingly economic interests all over sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, for years and years and years now. I could pull up stories about trying to sabotage elections in Madagascar. You talk about their military interests in Sudan, and so and on and on. China's development. I don't know that much about the economics of their developments in Africa, but they do seem to be extractive. I mean, there's fishing, there's mining certainly, and I wish I had an example to bring up right here. But how would you defend your position to someone who was suspicious that there was an Eastern imperialism coming from China as well?
Okay, maybe this time we'll take it from the other side. There's that one was a direct question to you, but I think they'll all go for the panel. And this will be sort of our final roundup, if that's good. I mean, that's a very important piece here.
Regarding the first question, I was kind of assuming, maybe due to the audience, that when I was speaking about Marxism, it was understood that it was Leninism, and that is clearly the principal driving force behind Eastern Marxism, insofar as Mao Zedong was a Marxist-Leninist, and the very kind of, I mean, the history of Maoism is complicated, and we don't really have time to get into that, but the fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism coming out of the split in the global socialist movement was between the social chauvinists who aligned on their national bourgeoisies and took the position, basically, that became the dominant position within Western Marxism, which is capitalist or imperialist accommodationism combined with anti-communism. And the other end of that split was represented by Marxism-Leninism that rejected that in favor of liberating the slaves in the colonies. And the fundamental contradiction of global class relations was imperialism. And so in that regard, I greatly appreciate your question for bringing up the name, but I took it to be implicit in much of what was already said. But you're right that it's important to point to it more directly. I'll just say as well, John, you raised some really important points. And the real question is not just pointing to the material systems that we need to produce in order to fight culturally, intellectually, politically, socially, economically, et cetera. It's actually building them, right? And so it's one thing to identify the problem. It's another thing to actually address it. And we're represented here, fortunately, by a lot of great organizations that people should support, help grow, et cetera, if it be Friends of Socialist China, Workers' World, Danny's informational platform. I'm myself involved in a whole series of material practices of building the infrastructure necessary to engage in theoretical class struggle and in practical class struggle. I'll give a shout out just to, because these are recent projects. The World Marxist Review was just launched not that long ago. I'm one of the editors-in-chief. We are trying to develop an international Marxist platform for rigorous intellectual work on, actually existing socialism that is not controlled by those who are opposed to actually existing socialism, who are real Marxists, or we could say MLs. And as well, the anti-imperialist Marxist book series that I've launched just recently with some others that's being published by Iskra Books. These are just two examples that I would encourage. What's that? AIM, like take aim at your enemies. Anti-imperialist Marxism. And the first book by Torkel Loyson was just published, actually, very, very recently. And so, but these are conversations that I think we should continue to have and continue to build up the infrastructure, right? And continue to collaborate and not fall into certain sectarian patterns that are very widespread or opportunist patterns that are very widespread within the Western left, so that we can all work together to push in the right direction. But that's all I have, so I'm going to pass it on.
Great. Thank you very much. Like a lot of threads to pick up and not very much time to do that work. I would 100% co-sign what Gabriel said in relation to Leninism, and it's a really good and a very important point, and I'm very glad Very grateful to see Heather anyway, so, who I haven't seen for several years. I think we last saw each other in East London a few years back. You know, Leninism, to me, is kind of, there's no Marxism without Leninism in today's age, because Leninism is Marxism in the era of imperialism, and we live in the era of imperialism. You know, it's core to the whole question, actually, of what Western Marxism is and what Eastern Marxism is. Eastern Marxism equals Leninism. It recognizes imperialism and the contradiction between oppressor nations and oppressed nations as the principal contradiction in global politics, and as the basic, you know, dividing line, the location of the barricades. You know, like, Leninism is the politics of the global class struggle. It is the politics that moves us out of, you know, the confines of the European workers' movement to the entire, you know, the struggle of the peoples of the world against imperialism. It's, you know, and that's specifically recognized in the Communist International Conference in 1920, right, where they update the slogan of our global workers' movement from the last words of the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, workers of the world unite, to workers of the world and oppressed peoples of all countries unite. That's what Leninism is, right? It's Marxism in the age of imperialism, and that's, you know, Leninism takes Marxism to China. Leninism takes Marxism to Korea, to Laos, to Vietnam, to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Burkina Faso, to Niger, to Mali, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I feel like it's a really important point to bring up the aspect of Leninism, but I think, among comrades, you know, it's implicit in everything that we've been talking about. You know, we're Leninists, and Leninism is Eastern Marxism. You know, I think that's a useful formulation. John raised a bunch of really interesting points. Just quickly, like, will China do more on the international stage? Clearly, China's global positioning is changing. When the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s kicked off the process of reform and opening up, their slogan, their kind of strategy was based on this slogan, hide our strength and bide our time. You know, they identified that they had a few decades, a rare opportunity, a window of opportunity where they could develop in peace, where they could more or less integrate into the global capitalist system on their terms, within their regulation, for the benefit of China, for the benefit of the Chinese people, and for the development of the productive forces, and to lay the ground for a more advanced form of socialism. They developed that opportunity, and they've taken that opportunity, and they've done very well with that. But, you know, that's clearly run out of road. You know, it's not a question in the West anymore. It's not a question in Washington, which direction is China going to go? You know, in the 1980s, even early 1990s, US strategists were thinking, China's just going to become another capitalist country. It's going to be integrated into the world capitalist system, you know, under our thumb. You know, it's going to be a subservient aspect of the global capitalist system, which is run out of Washington, D.C. It's clear that's not happening. China's following its own path. China is asserting its sovereignty. That's not going away. And, you know, China's rise is not going to be contained by any means other than military. You know, the US doesn't have the economic power anymore. It doesn't have the diplomatic power anymore to contain China, but it does have the military power, and that's the path it's taking. So China has to defend its own interests, and increasingly that means dropping this idea of hiding our strength and biding our time. It means being more assertive. It means pushing a multipolar world. It means pushing a world of peace. You know, China wants peace in West Asia. China wants peace in Africa. China wants peace in Latin America. Because China just wants ordinary relations. You know, China wants stable relations for trade, for investment, and all the rest of it. China wants to see the uplift of all humanity. You know, their foreign strategy is based around the old proverb that a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, whereas, you know, it's the opposite of the US's global strategy, which is based around militarism and war and creating a maximum of chaos in order to be better to be able to apply hegemony. So China is becoming more assertive, and I think we will see China play a much more active role in international affairs as it's been doing in relation to Palestine, as it's been doing in relation to Iran and Saudi Arabia, as Danny mentioned earlier. Very quickly on China and Africa, it's a related question. Yes, China trades with African countries. Yes, China invests in African countries. Yes, China is involved in the extraction of natural resources in African countries. But what you don't have, which you do have with the European relationship with the continent of Africa, what you do have with the US relationship with the continent of Africa, is the essential component of domination. You don't have wars, you don't have coups, you don't have assassinations, you don't have the dynamic of unequal exchange, you don't have coercion, you don't have illegal sanctions, you don't have structural adjustment and loan conditionality and all the rest of it. All of these mechanisms of domination, what you do have is respect for sovereignty. What you do have is deals that are conducted between equal partners. And if the proof of the pudding is in the eating, well, the pudding seems good, because finally Chinese investment and Chinese trade is allowing a lot of underdeveloped countries to finally break out of underdevelopment, a condition that they've been held in by the systems of colonialism and imperialism for 500 years. So China's playing a historically progressive role, and the facts speak for themselves on that. So that's it. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
We're going to give Danny the last word, so as it passes through me here, I'll just quickly say that it won't be the last word, because we have some wine and coffee and cheese and all kinds of goodies back there. So it's an opportunity to talk. It is an opportunity, if your book didn't get signed, to do that, but to really have more connection. There's also an important demonstration, by the way, in defense of Cuba and against the blockade of Cuba this Sunday at 1 o'clock at Grand Central Station. I really want to encourage folks listening online or here tonight to come. And after that, at 4 o'clock, we have a very interesting discussion here, a socialist discussion at 4 o'clock on Sunday. And just to invite you, for those interested, it's something that Workers' World organizes, of how we take on some of the issues and always explaining what's the immediate and concrete. Now, I've always considered myself a Marxist-Leninist, but at the same time, how do we understand the immediate tasks in front of us? And this is where I think anti-imperialist Marxism is an important characterization. When you consider Friends of Socialist China, you have groups coming from different political strands. Now, we could still fight each other on Stalin versus Trotsky, on Mao versus Deng Xiaoping, on, and we've all seen movements that will thrash at past ideological battles rather than understanding that the enemy is imperialism, and they have to find ways to cooperate, collaborate, and use the political understanding they've developed in order to do that in fact. And I think we all know these important ideological battles, and I'm not dismissing them, but at the same time knowing that against the most ruthless, we could talk about the Genocide 7, the most ruthless form of expropriation and mass murder. How do we confront it, and how do we speak to the workers here? Now, that really takes often a united voice or finding new ways to collaborate, and it also takes ways of really explaining the accomplishments of each of these countries that are risking everything in order to build a new society. So their defense is an important task for the working class here, to separate ourselves off from this imperialist mindset. And that happens in the universities, it happens in the streets, it happens in academia, and it happens in a union. So
The internet's going to go away.
Okay.
He leaves, so I need
Oh,
to-
all
I
right.
just need to
We're going to pass
wrap
it to
up.
Danny, and
Sorry.
I didn't know that. No,
Sorry.
that's important, and we'll see everyone for the discussions afterwards. So Danny, you do have the last word.
Yeah. I'll try to go through these very quickly because we're using some internet that's about to go away. To John's question about Chinese foreign policy, I mean, I think I would co-sign what Carlos said, but I would add to it I think China right now is in a very unique position. It has a lot of choices. It has options. It has the ability to navigate the world situation in a way that the United States and the West just cannot, because they're so bound by their contradictions, by the need to seek and destroy and to exploit. While China has the ability to navigate the world as I think a lot of dialecticians, real dialecticians who are looking at the world as it is, I believe that China has this unique position where it is taking what it can do and what it can get based on the situation in front of it. And the genocide in Gaza, the ability to bring together these groups, I think is a real outgrowth of the fact that what happened in West Asia and what it continues to happen has opened up opportunities for China to step in as this diplomatic force which can unite forces rather than just what China normally does, which I think is very understandable, which is work on a nation-to-nation basis, because the reality is that China has found itself both with what Carlos said in this opportunity to develop, but also to do so without bringing on the ire of the imperialists by being able to exist in this world while developing itself and then pursuing projects which do aid in the development of others, of other countries, of the rest of the world, but are hard to counteract through military means as much as the United States tries. I mean, just look at the U.S. in Africa versus China in Africa. To the other question, you see this huge difference where China builds roads. Yes, China will quote unquote extract, but that extraction is not based on taking those resources out of the principal country, bringing it to China with nothing in return. African countries and African people have benefited dramatically. I was in Beijing during the Forum on China-African Cooperation. I can tell you it was one of the worst times to be in Beijing because the entire city, it's the political capital, was essentially hijacked in a very good way by this incredible show of unity between China and African countries. You could not drive in Beijing for those 3 days without being in ridiculous traffic because the red carpet was rolled out for the African leaders so they can work out their deals and their cooperation and to increase the level of trade. So I see it as a dialectical relationship. African people and African nations, regardless of their governing systems, are looking at China as that alternative because they really have no other option, and China provides them what really is win-win cooperation. It can't be perfect. Carlos introduced me to a wonderful book by Deborah Brautigam, China's Gift, The Dragon's Gift. And she talks about projects that sometimes don't get done, sometimes don't work out, because there's so many forces at play. There's China's side, there's the African country side. Not everything works out. But all in all, I do see China moving forward in a continuously assertive path because the world situation is going to demand it, and I believe China's in that position to step up and play that role.
For future reference, it would have been better if you'd left that microphone on for your talk. This might work.
Are we done?
I think we're done, and I do want to thank, by the way, Wilton, who was the sound catcher here. I want to thank and Alex, Marsha, who's online doing all of this, and Danny, really. It's quite a combination.
To close this stream. All right, it was good to be with all of you. This was a kind of a special event, a unique event. I know it might not catch the interest of everyone here. I hope you all had a good event. I hope it was a good stream. Continue to like it, continue to share it. YouTube mobile is weird. Tomorrow I have Ben Norton on at 9 p.m. Eastern time. Tomorrow, what is that? October 25th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Ben Norton is coming on. We're going to talk about BRICS. We're going to talk about Israel and Iran. We're going to talk about everything under the sun, geopolitics. So be sure to come through. But I'm going to head out of here. I got to close up. All right. Be sure to like the stream before you go. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to go to the subscribe button, notifications bell, go to the video description to support the channel. We are going to be back tomorrow, back to the general geopolitical realm, all right? But it was great to be with all of you for the second time in a day. We had an incredible showing for Jeffrey Sachs and Victor Gao and Richard Wolff. I'll be back with Ben Norton tomorrow, all right? Peace out. I'm going to end this stream here if I figure out how to do that, and I will see you all again tomorrow.